Let's examine the top queen traps in the Scandinavian Defense. Here's the first one. White begins with the move pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to d5. This opening is known as the Scandinavian Defense, where black immediately challenges the center by attacking the pawn on e4. Now in this position, many players choose to develop their knight to f3. However, this is not a good move. It is a mistake. By doing so, white allows black to capture the central pawn while simultaneously attacking the knight, gaining a tempo. So, black captures the pawn, and now white develops the knight to g5. This was the main idea behind playing knight to f3 earlier. Additionally, this knight is also targeting the weak f7 square in black's position. If black gets greedy and tries to hold on to the pawn by playing knight to f6, white can respond with pawn to d3, luring black into capturing another pawn. Since black now has doubled pawns on the e-file and likely wants to eliminate the extra e4 pawn, they might not hesitate to capture it. So black plays pawn takes d3, and white can recapture with the bishop. At this point, white is putting significant pressure on the pawn at h7, making black feel uncomfortable. In response, black might make the mistake of playing pawn to h6. You might be wondering why this is a blunder. The reason is that this move allows white to execute the brilliant knight takes pawn on f7, forking black's pieces. If black captures the knight with the king, he will immediately lose his queen after white plays bishop to g6 with check. The king can attempt to move back to its original square to protect the queen, but he is forced to capture the bishop, leading to the loss of the queen. That's a pretty cool trap to learn, right? So, if you enjoyed this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Now, let's move on to the second one. Pawn to e4, pawn to d5, and here white decides to capture the pawn on d5 to bring the queen into play. So pawn takes pawn on d5, and queen takes pawn. Now white gains a tempo by simultaneously developing a piece while attacking the queen with knight to c3. If black moves the queen to the a5 square, white can continue with knight to f3, developing another minor piece and preparing for a quick kingside castling. Now if black makes the mistake of playing bishop to g4, thinking it is a good idea to pin the knight to white's queen, white can respond with pawn to h3. If black captures the knight with the bishop, white can recapture with the queen, immediately attacking the weak b7 pawn and indirectly targeting the trapped rook. At this point, what should black play? Black might try to block the attack by playing knight to c6, which seems like a natural move since it develops a piece and blocks the queen's attack. However, this is a mistake because white can now pin the knight to the king by playing bishop to b5. Now, the knight is under double attack from white's pieces and is only protected once by black's pieces. At this point, black will logically play queen to b6. However, this is another mistake. White can now completely shock black by playing knight to d5, attacking the queen while also eyeing the weak pawn on c7, setting up a potential fork on black's pieces. Since the queen is under attack, it will move to a5, but now white can trap the queen by playing pawn to b4. The queen can capture this pawn since it's protected by the knight. However, if black captures the bishop, white still has a winning move. White can now play knight to c7 with check, forking 3 of white's pieces. The king moves to d8, and now black's queen is lost. Now let's move on to the third trap. The game begins with pawn to e4, pawn to d5. White captures the pawn, and black recaptures with the queen. Now, white plays knight to c3, attacking the queen. The queen moves to a5, and here white can play an interesting move, pawn to b4. The idea behind this move is that white is sacrificing a pawn to activate the rook along the file, while also opening up lines for the dark squared bishop. If black fails to recognize this plan and greedily captures the pawn, white can respond with knight to b5, threatening to fork black's pieces. Black will likely move the queen back to a5 to defend the weak pawn on c7, but at this point, black doesn't realize that they are slowly falling into white's trap. White can now play bishop to c4, targeting the weak pawn on f7. At this point, black might play pawn to c6, which is the most common move in this position and has been played by thousands of players. However, this is actually a blunder. Why is this move a mistake? Because white can now play bishop takes pawn on f7 with check. If black's king captures the bishop, white can immediately launch an attack with queen to h5, delivering a check. Black will most likely try to block the check with pawn to g6, but this move leads to the loss of black's queen. Can you find the winning move for white here? The answer is knight to d6 with check. This move not only checks the black king, but also creates a discovered attack on black's queen. After black plays pawn takes knight, white can simply capture the queen, securing a winning position. Of course, there may be other possible variations in this trap, but this is the main idea behind it. Black may not always play exactly as shown here, but to understand how to handle different variations, stay tuned for my upcoming video, where I will cover the Scandinavian defense in detail. Now, let's move on to the fourth trap. This time, we will see how to trap white's queen in the Scandinavian defense. The game begins with pawn to e4, pawn to d5. White captures the pawn, and now, since our goal is to trap white's queen, we do not want to bring out our queen to recapture. Instead, the best move here is knight to f6, attacking the pawn with the knight. White might respond with pawn to d4, which appears to be a natural and logical move, so you should capture the pawn, and white might respond with pawn to c4, attacking the knight and gaining a tempo. Instead of retreating the knight to f6, you should move it to b4. However, this is actually a mistake. It is not a strong move because if you play this against grandmasters or highly experienced players, you might lose the game. So only try this trap against opponents who are not advanced in chess. Why is knight to b4 a mistake? Because it allows white to play queen to a4, delivering a fork. Now what should you do? You should play knight from a8 to c6, blocking the check while also defending the attacked knight on b4. At this point, white will most likely play pawn to a3, attacking the knight once again. So you should move your knight to the a6 square. At this point, white might feel confident, thinking they can win black's knight by playing pawn to d5. So white plays pawn to d5, attacking the pinned knight. Since the knight cannot move, white believes black has no good options here. However, instead of panicking, you should play knight to c5 first, attacking white's queen. White, wanting to maintain the pin on the knight to eventually capture it with the pawn, will likely move the queen to b5. But this is a mistake because now black can play pawn to e5. What is the idea behind this move? It helps open up lines for the dark squared bishop while also providing defense to the attacked knight. White will capture the knight with pawn takes knight. While it may initially appear that you have lost a knight for nothing, take a closer look at the position. White's queen is somewhat trapped on the side of the board because it doesn't have access to either of these two squares. The only available squares for white's queen are these two, but you can now control those squares as well. Notice that you don't need to worry about this particular square since it is already being controlled by your dark squared bishop. While the knight is currently blocking it, the bishop can still gain control of the square whenever needed. Now let's focus on taking control of the other key square, which is a5. How can we do that? Black can play pawn to b6, and now white's queen is essentially trapped. Where can white's queen go? If it moves to the only available square, which is b4, it loses anyway. Black can then play knight to d3 with check, which also uncovers a discovered attack on the queen. If white captures the knight with bishop takes knight, black can follow up with bishop takes queen, leading to the loss of white's queen. I hope you found these traps helpful in the Scandinavian defense. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess tips and strategies. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.